never forget, examining her mother's body on this dirty red carpet, real tight pile carpet, stained. And her mother had bilateral untreated breast cancer. You could literally look through her ribs and see her lung. And in life, she had been this way. This was not decomposition. She was literally rotting while alive. I was born in Monroe, Louisiana, up in actually in the Mississippi Delta, in northeastern Louisiana. Came home to my grandparents' home, lived there with my mother, who was a teenage mom, and grew up under the shade of the trees in the backyard of my grandmother's house. They had a place where they raised horses and mules and that sort of thing in big gardens. Very rural kind of environment at that point in time. It was a simple life. And had a grandmother that loved me dearly and a grandpa as well. My mother loved me very well, but it was a struggle. It was a hand-to-mouth existence. My grandmother came from a big family. And she had several sisters, but everybody looked up to the single male in the family, brother, and his name was Joseph, just as mine is. And he died 13 years before I was ever born. One day in the 50s, he had just gotten his hair cut, was leaving the barber shop. Back during those days, gentlemen would go to the barbershop several times a week to keep their hair trimmed. And as he was walking out, an assassin approached him that had he had developed a real hatred for my great uncle because of some contracts that he hadn't been awarded. The guy was a painter, and he gunned him down the street. And the tale goes that my uncle actually crawled beneath a car to get away from him. And this fellow took the revolver and stuck it beneath the car and continued to shoot him underneath the car. And that had an impact on, obviously, his sisters, the rest of the family. His parents were still living at the time. And it was kind of a slow death, I think, not necessarily for him, but for the family. And it scarred the family. And so when it came my time to be born, and I was the only grandchild, and I was a male, who better to be named after than they viewed him heroically. And it's a name that I bear proudly, but there's a legacy of death that comes along with that name, Joseph, for me.
How do you think it impacted you?
I don't know. I've always felt like that there was a bit of melancholy that has hung about, kind of sat on my shoulders for all these years. And in some twisted way, you think that you've been given a job to do. And for me, it was interpreting all that remained of people that had died.
How did you get your start in the industry, Joseph? Where did you begin?
My mother wound up remarrying, and she married he was, how can I describe it? He was a man that took advantage of my mother relative to her vulnerability. He was wealthy, certainly by our standards, degreed, had a great job, but he was also a sadist. Beat me incessantly, abused me, but I endured all of that through from about the age of 10 until I was able to get out of the house. And that really formed me as a death investigator, and I'll tell you why. His name was Bruce. The reason it helped me, this part actually did help me, by virtue of what I endured at his hand. I could go out on the most horrible. It's funny how your mind does these little gymnastics. I would go out on the most horrible cases, bodies that were swollen and decomposing and all of these things, and flies all about, and no one else wanted to be in the room with the body. But I could be in the room with the body, and I could look at what I was having to deal with, and I would say, this is bad, but it's not Bruce. And I just so happened to be working at the hospital, and the morgue in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, was being renovated. It was old, very old. As a matter of fact, it was so old that the morgue was actually located inside of the parish jail. So we had to you had to walk through a fence line and guards to get to the dead bodies. And you can hear prisoners in the prison. And the morgue was actually built on the site of the old gallows. And so it was this weird environment, but they were renovating this place, and I was working at this new hospital, and I happened to have this fellow that turned out to be my mentor, a brilliant forensic scientist who was in fact degreed in forensic science. He took a liking to me, and we became fast friends. I started attending autopsies at the hospital on my own. So can you imagine going to a morgue and going to autopsies in your off hours? I had no social life whatsoever. I was going to school, working, and then I would go to autopsies. And I would sit in there, and I would remain in a clean state, and the forensic pathologist that was working in there would give me their clipboard, and I would become their scribe. And finally, I kept coming back. I was like the bad penny that kept showing up. And so I volunteered one day to just start helping them clean. And to clean in a morgue is something that most people cannot identify with, because it's bloody. I mean, it's very bloody. And if you've got a decomposed body, you've got maggot husk, you've got live maggots that are on the floor, bone dust, all these other things. But I was kind of in this element of learning where everything that I saw, it was like this flood of information that was coming into my brain. Well, I continued on in this job, scribing and cleaning, volunteering time, until finally one day the pathologist looked at me and said, "Do you want to close?" And I was like clean up and close it? No, he's like, "Do you want to close? Do you want to stitch the body up?" And and I'm thinking, well, I'm not trained to do this. I've been watching you do it. And he's like, "They're not going to feel it." And so they taught me how to do what's called a baseball stitch, essentially. And you use this kind of S-shaped needle with kite string, of all things, very robust kite string. And you loop it around. And I began to stitch up bodies after this, placing the organs back in the body. They go into a bag. You place them into the body cavity, sewing up the body, and closing the head after the brain has been removed, and then cleaning the body and placing the body back in the cooler. I continued to do that. And then finally one day, he looks at me and says, "Do you want to open?" And I think I may have been 20, 21 when I was doing this. And I remember placing the tip of that blade, the left shoulder right here at the apex, and you make this diagonal line, diagonal incision ending up on the sternum, and you make another one on this aspect coming down to the midline of the sternum, and then all the way down to the pubis. And you create what's referred to as a classic Y incision. And then you begin to reflect the tissue and open up, and you can see the ribs and the breastplate, and then you learn how to open that with literally a pair of limb shears. You don't use a saw. And then all of a sudden the organs are there before you, and you have this specimen, this person, and this is not like a gross anatomical dissection that you see medical students doing. I'm in a world of forensics now, and this is what you don't, and probably I would have been much more fearful if I had this understanding now. Now as a forensic scientist, I look back and they've entrusted me to do this dissection, prosection as they call it with humans, on literally the biggest piece of evidence that you have in a case. This is not like somebody that's donated their body to science. This is somebody that's just come from a death. Now, it might not necessarily be a homicide. It might be a natural or a suicide or an accident. But yet this body has evidentiary value, so there's an added level to that. And they guided me, and I began to see the nuances in it, and I became pretty good at it. I wound up participating over the course of the totality of my career, wound up participating in roughly 7,000 autopsies. And for my money, it's the best classroom I've ever sat in. I knew that I wanted to be, in America, what we refer to as a medical legal death investigator. I love the science of it. I had no desire whatsoever to go around chasing crooks and all these sorts of things. I wanted to be a scientist in the field.
And what is a death investigator?
Oh, okay. Well, a death investigator, a medical legal death investigator specifically, is an individual who goes to the scene of any kind of death. If the police are there, we work in concert with the police. We do not work for the police. In the case of a homicide, for instance, the police, they have an interest in the body. We've got that template in our mind that you see in movies. But that's only the start for a homicide investigator. They're going to go out and try to find the person that perpetrated this crime. For us as medical legal death investigators, my interest begins and ends with the body, okay? Two different things. And no, we cannot narrow it down to this person died an hour ago or 10 minutes ago. You can't do that. And anybody tells you they can, they're lying. The best we can do is about a 3 or 4 hour window, but you have to have all of these calculations in order to even form that opinion. Then we do wound assessment, range of fire on injuries. We try to look at things like the neck to see if there are ligature marks, any kind of contusions / bruises anywhere on the body, any kind of insults to the body that are not something that is other than the product of day-to-day life, okay? Maybe somebody has equilibrium problems, they bump into furniture all the time. That's not necessarily at the hand of another. So then we assess the environment. Are there drugs in the house? What kind of drugs are there? What are the living conditions? Do they even have food in the house? Because that plays a big deal. We do child death investigations. Well, is the child being fed regularly? Are they being bathed? Just normal Maslow's hierarchy, right? I mean, do you have the normal comforts of life in dwelling this space where these people lived? So we do all of those assessments and bring that back to the forensic pathologist, and they can factor that in, whereas the cops have gone off and done their thing. And cops, yeah, they investigate suicides to a certain degree, but what are you going to charge somebody with? It's a suicide. So that rests primarily on us. Those are the most difficult cases and in most places, suicides will outpace homicides 2 or 3 to 1.
Joseph, are there any cases that have stuck with you throughout your career?
Well, the cases that have, all of us that work either in police service or coroner service, it is pretty much rote that our default position is always, it's kids. When you bear witness to the deaths of kids, or you don't bear witness to their actual death, but all that remains, if you will. You get into that space and you begin to see these things that took place. And that's the other thing that's very kind of haunting, if you will. When you enter into a space, you have evidence of a life lived. It's not just the body, it's everything that surrounds the body, the world that they inhabited, in life. You go to a crib and you see the little stuffed animals, maybe you see the stack of diapers and the wipes and, bottles and all those sorts of things. But it's also the aged too, those people that die in those spaces that they're all alone and their bodies are not found for maybe a year, and they died in this very lonely, dreary space, and no one was there to claim their remains. I've had cases, particularly one that stands out, of elder abuse. A grandma that was lived with her daughter. That was the daughter had placed her in the basement of her home in this room. Had no furniture. It had piles of dirty clothes and bed linens and all this stuff. And you would see old, like, food wrappers, like crackers and things like this that are left behind. A water bottle. The room reeked of urine. And there's a kind of the sickly sweet smell that comes along with that. And she had defecated everywhere over a period of time. I think that case stuck with me because the daughter had allowed it and had perpetrated this. It would have been more merciful if she had literally killed her, but she was so much of a coward, and she was purposed in this too. She kept her mother alive, all the while receiving her retirement checks, government checks, and that sort of thing, and living, as we say, high on the hog. You go into the upstairs of the house, all of the cupboards are full of food, clean, smelled nice, and her mother, I'll never forget, examining her mother's body on this dirty red carpet, real tight pile carpet, stained, and her mother had bilateral untreated breast cancer. And she had these huge ulcerated areas where her breast had been. And as a matter of fact, on the left aspect, so that if you look beneath the area where her armpit is, there was no longer where her ribs are, there was no longer intercostal muscle, that intercostal space there, where there's tissue, soft tissue, skin is all gone. You could literally look through her ribs and see her lung. And in life, she had been this way. This was not decomposition. She was literally rotting while alive. And I thought about my grandma. And what she had done for me. I know nothing about this woman. I don't know what kind of life she led, but I know that she didn't deserve this. That's on repeat. That I saw it with children. I saw it with children that were existing. Literally, I had 2 children that parents were drug addicted. They moved 26 times in 1 year, and they were eating dirty mop strings to survive. You can't take the measure of it most of the time, and most people, when you tell them these stories, they don't believe it. They don't believe that people could do this, and the reason they don't believe it is because they don't want to believe that kind of horror exists. Some people have they're so devoid of being able of any level of compassion, they will just take a life in a second, and they treat people like rubbish. When you're in the field with the dead, I've done examinations, scene evaluations, collected evidence on scenes where I've actually been shot at. Surrounded, I remember being surrounded by crowds of 300 and 400 people on the periphery outside the tape, and they're angry. There is no peace in that. There's bad lighting. You've got people hurling curses at you, or you're dealing with inclement weather. You're dealing with other people in your space while you're trying to focus on these fine little details at the scene. The morgue is absent that. It's a strange place to be in because you either have ceramic or stainless steel surfaces and instruments, and every drop of an instrument, every splash of a drop of water kind of echoes through that space. And it's very peaceful. And you have a moment in time where you can completely, through a scientific mind, begin to focus on the evidence that you're collecting, assessing the wound tracks, trying to understand what brought about this person's death. Scenes, however, can be unbelievable, the things that you bear witness to. And when you go into the field and you enter someone's home, you are always viewing the abnormal in the context of the normal. For instance, a homicide, actually a multiple homicide, I worked approximating Christmas years ago when I was still in New Orleans, and family member had come in and he had killed everyone in the house. And the house was decorated with Christmas decorations, and there was one of those old-fashioned kind of silver Christmas trees, with bulbs hanging on it and ornaments. Pictures of the children, presents already wrapped, and there's blood everywhere. It's not normal. It's abnormal. So when you go into that environment, you have to shut that part of your brain off. You have to shut that part of your brain off and be able to assess that space at that moment in time. You have to stop thinking about, these presents will never be opened. You're not going to hear laughter, and you're not going to hear the excitement of a child coming into the room on Christmas morning and seeing the toys that Santa has brought. It's not going to indwell that space any longer, ever again. That's what makes scenes so difficult for a lot of us that work as death investigators, homicide detectives, crime scene techs, photographers, because we bear witness to the most horrific things that many can't even imagine in their worst nightmares. And you literally have no one that you can share that with because no one else can identify with it. My early life informed my practice as a death investigator. Because of that trauma that I personally endured, it was on repeat. You would relive it. And it sounds horribly egocentric, but as a human, you begin to identify with the pain that these people are going through, the trauma they're going through, and you cannot, under any if you want to survive with your sanity intact, you can't take ownership over their grief. You can't. There's too much of it out there. You'll drown in it.
And how long were you a death investigator for, Joseph, and in which states of America were you working?
I started out in Louisiana and worked in South Louisiana in the New Orleans metropolitan area. And then I got offered a position in Atlanta, Georgia, as the senior investigator with the Fulton County Medical Examiner's Office. And I was there for probably 14, 15 years, I guess. And got there and worked. There were a couple of senior investigators. We managed the whole staff of investigators. We had more investigators there than we did in New Orleans, but we had more violent deaths in New Orleans than we had in Atlanta. And it's a 24/7 operation. Death doesn't stop at Christmas or, in America at Thanksgiving, when we take our holidays or at Easter, you're there. I mean, you're there I've worked some of the most horrific crimes on Christmas Eve, for instance. You're there 24/7. It never stops. Because if you do take a pause, as grotesque as this is, bodies start to stack up. So yeah, I finished up, and the last time I left the medical examiner's office in Atlanta, my job was in the back of an ambulance because I thought I was having a heart attack. I thought I'd been having a heart attack for probably 6 months. I'd gone to the hospital multiple times, and it turned out they were panic attacks, and the room started spinning. I just had lunch with one of my closest friends who was a police officer, and I collapsed on the floor, shallow breathing. And I'll never forget, they came over the loudspeaker. I can still hear it ringing. We need all the doctors to the investigator area. And a psychiatrist told me after she did my assessment, initially, I was like a child almost. My wife had to lead me around. She told me at the time, she said, you're the worst. I'll never forget this lady's name was Dr. Rao. She was a real angel. She said, you're the worst case of PTSD I've seen since my residency working with Vietnam veterans. And I remember trying to form the words work, because being a death investigator was my total identity. It's everything I was. I'd known no other occupation since I was 20 years old. It's all I'd ever done. And I remember trying to form the words. My wife is sitting here. She's pregnant with our son, Isaac. And we just have celebrated his 20th birthday, and he passed away 20 years ago. I'm sorry. I apologize.
No, you don't need to apologize.
Please forgive me. I'm sorry.
No, please don't apologize.
I remember trying to understand what I was going to do with my life. And I distinctly remember Dr. Rao, the psychiatrist, giving me this assessment. And I do have a recollection of asking her about work. And it was a real, as we say, a real cold cup of coffee. She said, not only can you not go back to the job, but if you attempt to do it, I'm going to have you judicially committed. You're in that kind of, and I never really appreciated. She said, we've got to slow your brain down. And they put me on these horrible medications. I think initially I probably slept for about 3 or 4 days. And then you just kind of feel like a zombie for a period of time. And I didn't know what I was going to do with myself. And thankfully, forensics through true crime has been all of the rage, these last 2 decades. And for me, blessedly, I got offered an opportunity at a small university up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And it couldn't have been a better place, because it removed me from the crush of the metropolitan area up into this beautiful setting. And I was able to go there and help start a forensics program. I've taught now 20 years. I've got kids that are practicing in forensics all over the world. I'm very proud of that.
And finally, you've told us, understandably, about the difficult parts of your work and how that kind of stays with you. What did you love about being a death investigator, and what drove you?
At the end of the day, as a death investigator, we're not merely scientists. In a way, we're historians, and this is why. Great people have books written about them, okay? As a death investigator, I might go out to the scene of some elderly person that's died, and they've lived, quote unquote, just this normal, vanilla life. No one else, many times, is there to document their passing, except for people like me. I have to do the best job to honor that person and their life that's left behind. And this might be the only thing that has ever been written by this individual, about this individual, rather. And it's almost a sacred duty when you're documenting that individual's life, that they even existed for a moment. Mama tells you when you're young, don't pull the thread on the sweater or the whole thing will come unraveled. For us, I want to pull that string. If I have a homeless person that's found dead in the street, they're forgotten. If I can get them identified and then begin to kind of fill in their life, what brought them to this spot, I might be, or my colleagues might be, the only person that ever documented that they existed. And these cases, as we speak right now, these cases are happening all around the world. And so we in the medical legal community, we do remember the dead and memorialize them in our own way and document that they actually existed. And that's very powerful when you think about it.
I've probably cleaned up close to 300 or 400 different scenes where people have disemboweled themselves, put a knife in their stomach and cut themselves open while they're alive. Even one gentleman decided to take some scissors and cut his intestines while he'd done it and throw them in the bath.